The U.S. military has spent 3 months pounding Iran, and China has been watching every sortie, every gap in the missile shield, every adjustment, every mistake. The Pentagon knows it. The analysts know it. And right now, in rooms you'll never see, military planners on both sides of the Pacific are processing the same war and drawing very different conclusions. 3 months ago, U.S. forces launched what would become one of the most consequential military campaigns of this decade, a sustained air war against Iran. The war has now entered its 3rd month, and it's providing China with a direct window into how U.S. military capabilities perform under real combat pressure. But here's the part the headlines aren't telling you. CNN spoke with a range of experts in China, Taiwan, and elsewhere about how the fighting in and around the Persian Gulf can inform what might happen in any possible conflict pitting Beijing against Washington. The picture those experts painted is unsettling. Not because America is losing, it isn't, but because winning a war and preventing the next one are two completely different problems. If you want this story covered fast, factually, and without the noise, subscribe now. Because what's happening in the Persian Gulf is already reshaping the military math in the Pacific. Here's what we know. The U.S. went into Iran with some of the most advanced air power ever assembled: F-35s, B-2 stealth bombers, a campaign that knocked out missile launchers, naval vessels, and bridges, mixed with cheaper guided munitions dropped from B-1s, B-52s, and F-15s. By conventional metrics, it's been overwhelming. But Iran didn't just absorb it. Iran adapted. And that adaptation is what has military planners in Beijing, Taipei, and Washington paying very close attention. Analysts note that Iran was able to penetrate U.S. air defenses in the Persian Gulf using relatively primitive technology: low-cost Shahed drones and lower-cost ballistic missiles. Let that settle for a second. The most sophisticated air defense umbrella America has ever deployed, the Patriot system, THAAD, got poked through by cheap drones. Not broken, not defeated, but penetrated. Qianshao, a former colonel in China's Air Force, said his major takeaway from the fighting so far is that the PLA can't forget about its defenses, noting how Iran found ways around U.S. anti-missile systems like the Patriot or THAAD. He didn't say this nervously. He said it as instruction. We need to devote significant efforts to identify weakness in our defensive side to ensure we remain invincible in future wars, Fu told CNN. That's a Chinese military officer watching American systems take hits and immediately running the calculation for his own military's gaps. The U.S. has also been adjusting on the fly, pivoting from punishing airstrikes to a blockade of Iranian ports and hardening aircraft shelters after key assets, including an AWACS radar plane, were lost. So America is adapting, but here's the problem. Every adaptation is visible, and China is taking notes. More than 2 months into the Iran war, many analysts are still scratching their heads that wartime leaders in Washington did not plan for an Iranian shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz, a chokepoint left unguarded in the planning, in a war the U.S. started. What else was left unguarded? That planning gap didn't go unnoticed in Beijing, and what China saw in that gap may be far more dangerous than anything Iran has fired. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what China has been building. The PLA has rapidly expanded its offensive firepower in recent years, adding missiles with hypersonic glide vehicles that can evade interceptors and the platforms to launch them. The PLA Air Force is adding fifth-generation stealth fighters at a rapid rate and will field around 1,000 J-20 jets, the rough equivalent of U.S. F-35s, when performing in a long-range precision strike mode, according to British think tank RUSI. China also has a long-range stealth bomber, similar to the U.S. B-2 or B-21, in development. That's one side of the ledger. But the Iran war is revealing that hardware isn't the whole story. Craig Singleton, senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, told CNN, tactical wins don't equal political outcomes. Military pressure has not translated cleanly into a durable political settlement. For China, that reinforces a core lesson. Battlefield success doesn't automatically produce the end state you want. And then there is Taiwan. China's ruling Communist Party has vowed to reunify with the self-governing democracy, despite having never controlled Taiwan. Chinese leader Xi Jinping has not ruled out using military force to do so. In Taiwan, analysts recognize that China has assembled a military that can match both the U.S. in high-tech precision weaponry and Iran in low-cost, high-volume drone warfare. Long-range rockets and drone swarms will definitely play a key role in China's joint military operations against Taiwan, said Che Chung, an associate research fellow at Taiwan's Institute for National Defense and Security Research. Do you think Beijing will use what it's learned from watching this war to accelerate its timeline on Taiwan? Or does the complexity of what's happening in Iran make China more cautious? Drop your read on this in the comments, because the analysts are genuinely divided. The head of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, Admiral Samuel Paparo, told a U.S. Senate hearing in April that drones make warfare much more costly for the offensive side. He has advocated filling the Taiwan Strait with thousands of drones, in the air, on the water, and beneath the sea, to make it difficult for the PLA to cross the waterway to move on Taiwan. Beijing has almost certainly processed that statement, and the question now isn't whether they heard it, it's how they intend to answer it. Here's the number that nobody is putting at the top of the story. A 2025 report on China's drone program states that Chinese civilian manufacturers have the capacity to retool in under a year to produce 1 billion weaponized drones annually. 1 billion per year. A recent government watchdog report said Taiwan's military's current drone countermeasures are ineffective and pose a major security risk to critical infrastructure and military bases. Against 1 billion drones a year, ineffective countermeasures aren't a vulnerability. They're an open door. Picture this. You live in Taipei. You work in a tech park, maybe 30 minutes from the coast. Your parents live an hour south. You've grown up hearing about the threat across the strait. It's background noise, a political problem for generals and diplomats. But then the Iran war starts, and for the first time in your lifetime, the strategic gap between possible conflict and actual war feels like it just got a little narrower. That psychological pressure is real in Taiwan right now, and the defense community is feeling it acutely. Jean Su, the managing director of Taiwan's flagship drone manufacturer Thunder Tiger, called for more investment in Taiwan's capability to mass-produce drones. We need to produce continuously, day and night, to counter our enemies, he said. Day and night. That's not the language of peacetime planning. That's urgency. Taiwan is not sitting still. It is taking steps to improve its drone countermeasures. But the gap between taking steps and being ready for a war-scale drone assault is measured not in months, but in years of production capacity and strategic coordination. And here is something that doesn't make the headlines enough. The PLA hasn't faced hostile fire since a war with Vietnam in February 1979. That's 47 years without a shot fired in anger. 4.5 decades without the unraveling that real combat forces on any military plan, any doctrine, any assumption about how your systems actually perform. For the soldiers, sailors, and pilots of the PLA, combat is a concept, not an experience. For the people of Taiwan, that might sound reassuring, but experienced analysts see it differently. A military that has never been tested under fire can convince itself it's ready. It can look at its equipment lists, its numbers, its satellite imagery of U.S. operations in Iran, and calculate that it understands what it's looking at. But Drew Thompson, a senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore, offered a historical example. During the Korean War, China had better fighter jets in Soviet-made MiG-15s. But U.S. pilots flying the inferior F-86s outperformed them because many brought World War II experience to the air war. The lesson, Thompson said, an excellent pilot in a mediocre airplane will always beat a mediocre pilot in an excellent airplane. Experience irreplaceable, impossible to acquire from satellite feeds and analysts' reports. If China were to engage in a conflict with the U.S. in the next decade, Washington would retain a large number of personnel who faced combat in the current Persian Gulf conflict. People who've lost comrades, lost assets, achieved overwhelming victories, and executed precision warfare at a high level. That's not just hardware advantage, that's human advantage. And it's the one thing you can't manufacture on a factory floor, even one capable of producing 1 billion drones a year. Here is the question that keeps regional commanders awake. China watches the Iran war and learns. America watches China watching the Iran war and adjusts accordingly. Taiwan watches both, racing to close gaps it publicly acknowledged are critical. The U.S. Navy has been cautious about sending ships through the Strait of Hormuz into the Persian Gulf, aware of Iran's asymmetric warfare capabilities. If that's how America behaves toward Iran, what does a conflict in the Taiwan Strait actually look like when a near-peer adversary runs the same playbook at 10 times the scale? And then there's the chokepoint problem, the one Washington didn't plan for. Singleton warned, Iran's ability to leverage a choke point and ingest risk into global supply chains shows how quickly a localized conflict can become internationalized. For Beijing, that's a warning that any Taiwan scenario would immediately implicate global trade, energy flows, and third-party actors in ways that are hard to imagine. A conflict over Taiwan wouldn't stay in the Taiwan Strait. It never could. The world's shipping lanes, tech supply chains, semiconductor flows, all of it runs through that region. One miscalculation doesn't just affect two militaries. It affects your phone, your fuel, your job. The Iran war is not just a Middle East story. It is right now being read as a manual by military planners, defense analysts, think tank researchers, and intelligence agencies on multiple continents. Every battle damage assessment, every drone that slipped through a missile shield, every port blockade, every lost radar plane, it's all being filed and processed. Chinese military analyst Song Zongping said of the Iran conflict, "This is what real warfare looks like." He's right. And it looks messier, more adaptive, more unpredictable than any war game or computer simulation. The experts CNN spoke to flagged something important. They warned of China misreading its own strengths, its lack of combat experience, and holding too narrow a view of the conflict and its consequences. That warning cuts both ways. Overconfidence is dangerous, but so is underestimating an adversary who has just spent 3 months studying your every move from the outside. The Iran war isn't over. The political settlement has not materialized cleanly despite military pressure, which means the U.S. is still exposed, still adapting, still generating data that China can use. And Taiwan sits in the background of all of it, a democracy that China's Communist Party has vowed to bring under its control. Watching two giants circle each other across two different seas, wondering which lessons each will ultimately act on. The drones are being built. The stealth jets are being deployed. The admirals are testifying. The defense ministers are watching satellite footage of burning ships in the Persian Gulf. What happens next in this story isn't written yet, but the people writing it, in Washington, in Beijing, in Taipei, are doing so with more information than they've ever had before. And that's precisely what makes the next move so dangerous. This story is not standing still. What happens in Iran in the coming weeks will keep feeding the calculations happening right now in Beijing and Taipei. The next development could shift the entire equation. What do you think? Is China more likely to act on what it's learned, or does the complexity of what it's watching make it more hesitant? Put your take in the comments and subscribe, because when this story moves, we cover it fast, factually, and without the noise.